My name is Ben Packard, and I serve as the Executive Director here at EarthLab. And I just want to say welcome and thank you for what I hope proves to be a productive and interesting conversation for all of you. We have a fantastic mix of people in looking at the attendee list and the RSVP list for today. You represent practitioners, investors, sustainability officers, and many others from the NGO, corporate, public sector, as well as students, faculty, and researchers from here at the University of Washington and other institutions. This mix, I think, is a reflection of the diversity of actors that are going to be needed for us to address the systemic nature of the climate crisis. And for those of you that have not interacted with EarthLab, welcome, and thanks for your interest. We're a fairly new idea at the University of Washington, an idea that is to leverage the resources from across the university and contribute to society's effort to create a more sustainable planet. Our mission is to work in partnership with others to focus and accelerate University of Washington expertise on critical environmental challenges, and in so doing, improving people's lives and livelihoods. Think about us as a bridging academia, decision makers on critical environmental challenges. This happens through our member organizations that you can see listed here on the top of this slide, where we bring science into action, and through our innovation grant programs. We're served by 2 advisory bodies, a faculty steering committee, and an advisory council made up of individuals representing a diverse set of perspectives and experiences. Thanks to those of you who have been able to join us today from both of those advisory councils. Climate change is clearly the most important environmental challenge we face, and the stakes are high. You all understand that. You wouldn't be here today, that we're talking about nothing short of the health of planetary systems, the resilience of our communities, and our health. And in light of the conversation happening throughout protests of the brutal murders of Black people by police of late, we're reminded that to truly address climate change, we are required to face the unjust, disproportionate impacts on communities of color and historically marginalized communities from climate change. As others have remarked, there is no climate justice without social justice. Activity in the corporate sector over the last 12 months has been a bright spot in addressing the climate crisis. And as I took note of additional companies stepping forward with increasingly ambitious targets, I've been thinking about how we at the University of Washington connect to those 2 commitments and how we could potentially engage with them. Wondering to myself and others what these commitments mean and how could applied research help accelerate action in this area. The Distinguished Fellow position at EarthLab is a new one for us, and it offers us a chance to bring practitioner experience, voices, and insights into our work at EarthLab. And it's my hope to do more of this with people from a variety of experiences and perspectives in the future. So when I heard about Josh Henretig leaving Microsoft, someone who I'd known in the field for close to 15 years, I reached out to see if he was interested in a fellowship to explore these questions. Josh's experience is unique, and as you'll hear from his 17 years at Microsoft, he's a respected leader in this field, and we were lucky to have him for this spring quarter. When we talk about EarthLab as a bridge, we think of it as a 2-way street, not just us bringing academic experience out to decision makers. Instead, EarthLab and its member organizations and grantees are working in a way that acknowledges the lived experiences of a variety of communities and different knowledge systems that are wrestling with complex environmental challenges. And it's through these collaborations that EarthLab will support University of Washington faculty, researchers, and students to co-create new knowledge, supporting real-world decision-making and taking meaningful action on climate and other critical issues. So today is the culmination of Josh's fellowship. He's going to share with us what leading commitments are, what that might mean for University of Washington collaborations. And we now have had 6 conversations with over 80 people from Evans, the Clean Energy Institute, the Foster School of Business, the Climate Impacts Group, the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences, and the College of Built Environment. A special thanks to Ann Bostrom, Dan Schwartz, Amy Snover, Dan Brown, Abhinav Gupta, Emily Cox-Pankey, and Kate Simonon for these efforts in co-hosting these conversations over the last 2 weeks. Again, our goal is to start a conversation. We've initiated this conversation by identifying what the common elements are of the goals and of leading companies, what the drivers for action are, what those gaps are in their pathways to achieving those goals, and what the opportunities might be for collaboration. So what you're going to hear today may be of the most detailed and up-to-date summary of corporate climate commitments available right now. Let's take that in and together explore some questions that have come up already in conversation across campus, and then push a little further in the Q&A with all of you that we will moderate for the last 30 minutes of our time together. We want to explore what these commitments mean for further applied research opportunities at the university, and what kind of collaborations may help move action forward on climate change more broadly. Again, there's an interesting mix of people here today. Thank you again for joining us. We had over 100 people RSVP, and I look forward to the Q&A when we can learn more from the diversity of experience and expertise and perspectives to push our collective thinking on taking action on climate change. And with that, over to Josh Henretig, our distinguished fellow at EarthLab.
Well, thank you, Ben. I appreciate the introduction and really appreciate this opportunity to share my perspective and the conversations that we've been having these last several weeks with various stakeholders across the university. This is the final piece in that puzzle, and while I plan to speak for a short while here, I also hope this can be fuel to our collective insights about what's happening in corporate and private sector, specifically when it comes to climate ambition, and how we can collectively understand that to either bridge the gap between where we are today and where we need to be, and where there is room and opportunity for partnership. So as Ben mentioned, I have been at Microsoft for over 17 years, and I've been fortunate enough to play a role in helping shape and craft the sustainability commitments the company has made for many years now, from its first public commitment back in, say, 2007 or 8, all the way to its most recent commitment in January to be carbon negative and address its legacy emissions dating back to 1975. So while I'm certainly intimately familiar with what's going on at Microsoft, I also have had the opportunity to observe how other stakeholders, other organizations, other private sector companies are moving their climate agenda forward at the same time. And so this has been a really fun opportunity for me to investigate that even further and to share those insights through this conversation here. I think we're awash in a lot of complex issues these days, and climate change is certainly among them. As Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, which is one of the world's largest asset managers, recently said, climate change has become a defining factor in companies' long-term prospects. Global events like COVID-19 and this increasing array of extreme weather events all around the world are really testing corporate resiliency and are challenging global operations and supply chains, business models, and of course, the workforces themselves. And at the same time, ambition is rising. It was just a few years ago that private sector companies were praised for simply producing and publishing a sustainability report. And today, over 870 organizations are setting science-based targets. Leaders in the field are committing billions of dollars to climate solutions. And employees are staging walkouts to protest corporate action that simply don't go far enough. In the last 6 to 12 months, a number of private sector companies representing a variety of industries have stepped forward with an unprecedented level of ambition to manage and mitigate their own contributions to climate change and to make investments helping others adapt to those climate impacts. So this project really set out to understand the scope and combined impact of those commitments, to identify the gaps that private sector will ultimately need to overcome in order to meet their climate ambition, and to identify the opportunities for applied research and collaboration and partnership within the university system itself. Over the last few months, Ben Packard and the EarthLab team and I have had the opportunity to engage with a real diverse set of stakeholders from across the university, representing many of the departments Ben just mentioned, to really share a perspective and a point of view, but more importantly, to spark a dialogue about the relative state of corporate ambition, and ultimately to surface and explore opportunities that we all see for collaboration and partnership. So through the course of these conversations, there's been a number of themes that have come up. And I want to hand it off to Ben to walk through in a high level detail what some of those themes have been.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, so through the course of this conversation that we've been having with a variety of faculty, there's really 5 areas that I wanted to just highlight as you have in the back of your mind as Josh goes through and talks about what leadership looks like right now. I'm not going to read these questions, but take a look if you can at this slide. They have to do with motivations and accountability for corporate performance in this area. They have to do with questions of adaptation and resilience. Many corporate themes in the beginning just spoke about mitigation, which is critical. But as we all know, a lot of public sector and other sector agencies are asking questions about adaptation and resilience as well. They also focused on solutions and the unintended consequences potentially of a variety of solutions to mitigate and adapt to climate change and the access and justice issues associated with various solution pathways. We also looked at, through the course of these dialogues, collaboration and participation with academia. There are different expectations between academics and corporate sector partners in what success looks like, and we unpacked some of that in the course of these conversations. And lastly, we looked at a couple other areas, and I'll just point to these 2, around public health issues and justice issues, and how young folks coming out of college right now can make that leap between studying sustainability and working on sustainability from a variety of perspectives within companies. So with that, over to Josh.
Thanks, Ben. So at the beginning of this project and this fellowship, I really wanted to establish kind of a foundational data set that I could use to objectively understand, what some of the actions are that private sector were taking. So I chose to focus on an initial set of Fortune 500 companies and profiling these companies relative to their participation in effectively 8 different third-party organizations and their climate-related initiatives, which you can see on the right here. In my experience, companies who are prioritizing, who are funding, and ultimately committing resources to be able to engage with these third parties have established relatively ambitious climate commitments that ultimately require cross-sector collaboration and advocacy in order to deliver. Is it possible to game this system and these organizations? Absolutely. But I think in this day and age of transparency and hyper attention, it's becoming increasingly difficult. What participation in some of these organizations also mean is that it demonstrates a maturity and sophistication for climate-related strategies that, frankly, only companies who are really serious about these issues are able to take on. And so once I established the sort of objective level criteria and surfaced who among the Fortune 500 were committing to multiple climate-related initiatives, I then really picked up the phone, frankly, and spoke to over 25 different professionals across different industries, across different companies, to really understand fundamental questions like, what are the key questions your organization is going to need to answer in order to deliver on your climate agenda? How do you think about partnership? Do you already collaborate with organizations like the university and others? And how are you thinking about the future? How do you navigate the issues that are increasingly relevant when it comes to addressing climate-related risks? So you can see a number of these organizations over here on the right. I'm happy to talk in more detail during the Q&A about sort of what the signals that I'm reading from these organizations mean, but they certainly represent a broad array of the different types of organizational commitments that organizations can take. Great. So one attribute that many of, if not all of these companies share is a willingness to set specific, measurable, and even science-based climate goals. So there's really 4 primary dimensions that organizations have to consider when setting climate goals. The first is the scope of climate impacts. The second is the scope of activities within their value chain, from their core operations to their extended supply chain. The third is the mitigation approach. What are they going to do about it? And then of course, the fourth is the time frame, near term, long term, et cetera. And so when you examine the specific climate goals that organizations are setting, you often find differences in one or more of these dimensions, which at the end of the day really makes objectively comparing one commitment to another commitment, one company to another company rather difficult. But now you know why. It's largely because they have either exercised an ability to reach deep within their supply chain and set specific and measurable goals there, or perhaps they just don't have the resources to do that yet. They understand the urgency, they understand the need, but they haven't mobilized the internal resources in order to prioritize those set of initiatives. Apologies here, did I? Okay, sorry. So what you see when you look at multiple companies setting multiple goals across the landscape is a general trend towards standardized science-based climate goals. And increasingly, those are goals that are in line with a 1.5 degree Celsius pathway. What a 1.5 degree Celsius pathway effectively means to those that don't understand that is the IPCC has come out with a definitive conclusion that in order to keep carbon emissions in balance with what the rest of our climate and our planet need, we need to urgently and dramatically reduce carbon emissions so that we keep temperature ranges within a 1.5 degree pathway. And what leading organizations like the Science Based Target Initiative has helped private sector do is to effectively take what the global context of that data and break it down into a sector and specific company view so that individual organizations can now determine what their fair share of that global allotment is they need to do and mobilize in order to dramatically reduce their own carbon emissions. And so what you're seeing here is a general trend towards that standardized mechanism of goal setting. And that effectively means that these companies have to first account for the scopes of their emissions, which in corporate lexicon is talked about in scopes 1, 2, and 3. Scopes 1, of course, are those emissions that may come from your direct operations. At Microsoft, it would be the backup data center generators that are used to provide backup power supply to those facilities. Scope 2 emissions are typically the energy purchased to power those data centers, to power your office buildings and manufacturing. And then scope 3 emissions, of course, are the long tail of supply chain emissions. These are arguably the largest and hardest to manage and ultimately to mitigate. But in order for us all to enjoy a sustainable future, we need sort of economy-wide mobilization on managing and reducing these emissions on a global scale. So that is a stark difference from where we've come over the last, say, 10 years, where organizations, including Microsoft, were setting specific goals that were more convenient and limited to narrow scopes of control. So at Microsoft, we had a carbon neutral commitment dating back to 2012, in which we defined carbon neutral, our ability to neutralize carbon emissions for our scopes 1 and 2 footprint. And limited scope 3. And the reality is the company has come to the realization that that wasn't going far enough, and more companies are starting to do the same, and they're generally leaning towards these comprehensive accounts or accountabilities for the scopes of these climate impacts. So I wanted to introduce another concept that I think is important to first understand how these organizations are setting these goals and how they're increasing accountability and responsibility for a wide variety of climate-related impacts. I think it may seem that some of these organizations are simply holding their finger up in the air and looking for a signal from the wind before kind of naming the goal du jour. And the reality is that many of these organizations, and when I say organizations, I'm actually referring to a small set of sustainability professionals within these organizations, tasked with defining and shepherding that strategy along. What they're doing is desperately trying to figure out what issues are most material to their business. And then how do you unlock the resources within the organization that will enable them to address these material issues with urgency and with impact, while also broadening accountability for those impacts across the value chain. Nearly all organizations I've encountered who ultimately embark on this sustainability journey ultimately start off crawling before they run, which means that it's critical that they prioritize appropriately and ultimately address the source impact areas most material to their direct operations. But as these teams demonstrate success, as the rest of the organization begins to lean in and they develop those internal partnerships within the business itself, they earn the opportunity to expand that agenda. And that agenda ultimately expands across the scope of environmental impacts as well as the scope of activities that you see on these access points. So what does it take to be a leader in 2020 and beyond? I think we all recognize that any organization can gin up a provocative climate-oriented headline. We've seen them all. You saw some on the first slide that I showed here. But what you typically see in companies that are leading the way is an effort to go beyond the status quo and develop a differentiated strategy that simultaneously drives business value and embeds sustainability across the business. The net result here is that new capabilities and increased capacity within the company are unlocked, which help drive that transformational change at scale. And so in these leading organizations, accountability for climate doesn't just reside on the chief sustainability officer's shoulders, but rather is integrated across the organization. Of course, the C-suite has to be involved, the CEO, the CFO, the chief operating officer, perhaps. But so does the average employee who is enlisted in a way that takes advantage of that person's unique skill set, regardless of their title. In these most advanced organizations, specific feedback mechanisms are starting to be established across the various layers and silos within the organization itself to help drive alignment and calibrate performance and learn from new and innovative projects and programs. And ultimately, subject matter expertise is dispersed. It's initially developed within perhaps a sustainability team itself, but ultimately it begins to move across the business into the core functional business areas within the company that only increase the communication and help drive the innovation in all aspects of the company. The last point I just wanted to raise here, and this is one of the more challenging issues that any sustainability professional has, is how to unlock financial capital, how to get these projects funded, how to get their strategy and their climate agenda funded. And when you look at the most sophisticated organizations, what they are doing is effectively implementing creative mechanisms such as an internal carbon tax, which, as I mentioned, Microsoft has had since 2012, that have really helped the capital flow across the organization instead of just your traditional top-down funding mechanism approach. And so these are just a few of the capabilities that leading organizations have unlocked. And so I wanted to provide this perspective both across the material impacts that we have to account for, the scope of the emissions, and then the hard work of really embedding these type of core capabilities within the organization itself. All right. So what's driving private sector to take more ambitious action on climate change? I think this would be a fun opportunity to brainstorm, and perhaps we can do this at the end here. I've come up with 5 issues and areas that I think are increasingly informing action that private sector is taking, and I'll walk through a few of them. According to the CDP, which stands for, well, was formerly called the Carbon Disclosure Project, companies are becoming increasingly aware of the potential risks and environmental impacts of their business. In fact, over 60% of the largest US global companies have reported on their efforts to mitigate these risks in the last 5 years. And so awareness is at an all-time high. Climate advocacy and employee engagement are increasingly important. At the end of 2019, many of you will remember on the cover of Time magazine was the 16-year-old climate activist Greta Thunberg. Her leadership has really emboldened others to have the courage to stand up all around the world. Last September, more than 1,700 Amazon employees pledged to walk out of work for the Global Climate March, but that was quickly followed by employees from Microsoft, from Google and WeWork and others. And as the workforces of tomorrow, the companies of today are increasingly accounting for their workforce of tomorrow, they're realizing that 3/4 of the workforce in just the next 6 years will be made up of a younger generation. And that younger generation is exercising a preference for companies who have values and who put sustainability on the list of priorities. Government and corporate ambitions are certainly rising. If you look back at 2019 by itself, it was really bracketed by 2 big proposals. One, the sprawling government legislation dubbed the Green New Deal in the US, and in the EU, it was the Green Deal with the circular economy principles embedded at its core. And regardless of how these specific policy proposals have or have not moved forward, the scale of the thinking is really pushing and creating ripples across industries and across sectors. Because the same thing is happening with companies. Companies' goals are getting bolder. The table stakes for sustainability leadership are rising. And a good indication of that ambition is simply looking at the pace of renewable energy and the private sector's commitment to renewable energy. As you'll see in a moment, if you look at the top 20 organizations acting on climate change, nearly all of them have 100% renewable energy commitments. They're also setting science-based targets, and they're pursuing the most aggressive carbon reductions that put them and their stakeholders and value chains in line with a 1.5-degree future. Business leaders are starting to question or not just starting, but have questioned shareholder primacy and capitalism. If you'll remember that last August, nearly 200 CEOs of giant multinationals who are all a part of the organization, the Business Roundtable, declared an end to a decades-long obsession with shareholder returns and focusing instead on creating value for all stakeholders. As such, more companies are starting to examine their purpose and listening to what consumers want and expect from the most resilient brands. And last but not least, circular and sustainable innovations are thankfully finally becoming a competitive differentiator. Companies are increasingly investing in and showcasing new innovations in products and services in an attempt to distance themselves from competition and just at the end of the day win over customers. Having participated in that firsthand at Microsoft, I can tell you that the cloud service providers, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Amazons, are all participating in a race for the top to be able to showcase the most sustainable data center to their customer base. The food and beverage companies are jockeying for sustainable and regenerative agricultural practices and featuring them on labels and on products. And the outdoor apparel brands, of course, continue to elevate sustainably sourced materials alongside methods toward repairing and keeping garments in use longer. And so these are among the many different indicators and trends that are really pushing private sector to reevaluate their existing positions and ensure that they are positioned and doing the most they can for the future. So what are leading brands doing? when I looked at the data and I calibrated individual organizations within the Fortune 500 list, what I saw is that first, those top 15 companies are responsible for approximately 300 million metric tons of CO2. But at the same time, they're investing and financing over $100 billion in climate-related activities. 11 out of 15 of them have set science-based targets, while 13 out of 15 are leveraging their government affairs teams, their brands themselves, to really advocate for either federal or state level climate-related policies. And as I said before, near all of them have committed to 100% renewable energy. When you start to unpick the performance in particular, what you see by evaluating their individual CDP scores, and again, these are organizations who have accounted for their environmental impacts, packaged that up and submitted it to the third-party CDP, who then grades these companies on their relative performance. What you see is an average score of an A-, which is really high and hard to achieve for those that have done that work before. But what you also see is that there are certain industries that are leading the way, and technology is among them. So I'm going to quickly speed through a number of these sort of high-level views just to highlight when I looked objectively at those industries and those companies that were exercising a preference for and a commitment to a variety of climate-related initiatives. This is kind of how it breaks down in terms of an industry view. And when you look at the companies, you can see, again, technology largely leading the way, but you also see retail, you see financial services, you see fashion and apparel. All of these are leaning into this conversation. And I will just say this about the kind of the counting of initiatives. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you have the most number of initiatives for your company, that you're doing the most. I understand that. This was really a simple way of understanding the landscape of who was exercising that preference for climate initiatives, and then ultimately using that as a lens to examine what specific commitments were organizations making. And this is the same view for those that want to understand kind of what climate leadership looks like in the Northwest. All right, so as I mentioned, I built a data set. I looked objectively at the Fortune 500 list. I whittled that list down to about 130 different companies. And then ultimately, I peeled back the covers. I picked up the phone, I did some desk-based research, and I really understood what is it that these organizations are committing to? How much financial capital are they putting into play? Under what constraints are they setting their climate agenda and their specific and measurable goals? And how are they thinking about integrating these commitments into some of their core products and services? And what I found when I dug into that were a few things, and these are some of the high-level takeaways. I've mentioned the science-based outcomes. I think that's important. I just wanted to hit it one more time over the head, that this is a movement, and an important one at that an increasing number of organizations are starting to align on standard methods for reducing their global impacts in a time and in an urgency that will hopefully move us collectively to a 1.5-degree pathway. That means, of course, in order to do that, you have to have a hyper-focus on decarbonization. And forward-looking companies are not just accelerating that transition for their own operations, their own facilities to 100% renewable energy, but they're leaning into their supply chain and their partner networks and even their customer base and asking how and implementing ways to decarbonize those emissions as well. Nature-based pathways, this is all about how they think about and make investments in nature. And more companies are doubling down on nature, making investments in forests and soils and oceans, both as mitigation efforts to account for those emissions they can't reduce, but also has adaptation solutions that help protect the environment while providing numerous economic benefits. There's some really great examples out there for those that have seen them or want to know about them. Amazon, together with the Nature Conservancy, has launched the Right Now Fund and has committed $100 million to restore and protect the world's forests, wetlands, and peatlands. And I think they've their most recent projects target small landowners in Vermont and urban climate change in Germany. Apple has moved capital to protect 1 million acres of working forests. Starbucks, of course, is trying to ensure that 100 million healthy coffee trees are available to their value chain of coffee farmers that need them by 2025. And so there's really some exciting work and some real money being put into play here. Carbon removal and storage is becoming increasingly important. And so what's happening here is, as companies set these science-based goals and they focus on net zero as the ultimate outcome, what they realize is that they can't reach those goals without both deeply cutting their emissions and removing emissions from the atmosphere. And so to do this, it really involves developing and deploying technology that can capture emissions before it enters the atmosphere, removing the carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gas emissions, and then storing that permanently in the ground. And while engineered solutions like direct air capture offer a lot of promise, I think, some of the key questions that will need to be answered are around kind of whether these technologies can be cost effective, and whether there are unintended consequences that we really need to account for. Circular economy, for those that aren't aware of this issue and its importance, it's estimated that 9% of the 93 billion or so tons of minerals, fossil fuels, metals, biomass, et cetera, that enter our economy are captured and reused annually, 9%. And at the business level, companies are trying to move beyond principles and theory and towards these specific and digital tools that really allow them to take action, to fully assess the scope of material flows through their value chain and in their operations, and ultimately, create more circular loops for those materials, both to capture a greater value, but also to reduce their waste streams. Tackling the supply chain, it goes without saying, this is effectively that long tail of climate impacts that any organization has to account for. And to date, most companies have done something around addressing their direct impacts on scope 1 and 2, while indirect emissions, both up and downstream in the company's value chain, are often unabated. And what's exciting to see is more organizations, especially the leading organizations, starting to lean in here. And it's going to be interesting to see sort of how quickly they can mobilize and engage those value chains to collectively move us to a more sustainable future. So in addition to kind of looking at these key takeaways, I did actually profile a number of different companies. I'm not going to walk through those profiles there. If we want to reserve some time at the end in the Q&A, and you guys have questions about what's company XYZ doing, or and I happen to know, I'm happy to talk about that there. But I wanted to transition now, because after I analyzed the relative state of climate ambition, and after I picked up the phone and had the conversations, what I wanted to understand is what kept these stakeholders up at night. What were they worried about? Where did they need help effectively in bridging where they are today and where they want to be in the future? And so many of these themes you'll see echo from the high-level themes I just shared, but I'll walk through them at a high level here. So there's a number of issues in sort of tackling emissions associated with supply chain. Whoops, sorry about that. Chief among those issues is standard ways of quantifying impacts. Frankly, there's a lot of subjective determination within that process to say, what does impact actually mean? And that needs to get more formalized. That needs to get standardized. And that's something that a lot of organizations are leaning into. Organizations are going to need better monitoring and performance management tools to be able to ensure that they're tracking towards some of these climate-related goals. They're also going to need to think about how to leverage their influence. What type of incentives need to be put in place across these value chains, and how do they ensure that those incentives are equitable? Because remember, these global supply chains are just that, they're global. And that means that not all of these partner organizations have the same capacity, have the same resources that others do. And so that's something that will need to be addressed. I know this is a broad bucket, but innovation is certainly something that I continue to hear, and it means something different probably to everyone. But when it comes to the academic opportunities for partnership, translating academic research and discovery into practical applications and data that others can use is something that I heard when I talked to folks. I also heard that private sector needs help convening diverse stakeholder groups, and that can really create a common understanding of issues and problems and provide that pre-competitive space in order to surface new solutions, new ideas, and ways of going after opportunities together. And there's also fundamental breakthroughs that many organizations are still looking for in material science. And those breakthroughs need to focus on performance and regeneration, responsibly sourced and renewable or recycled materials. I was personally really pleased to see issues of climate justice and equality surface in some of the conversations I had. It goes without saying that as we think about deploying these billions of dollars, as we mobilize these incredibly innovative companies, we have to be considerate and create space for listening to diverse and disadvantaged groups in the planning and certainly the policymaking process. And ensuring that as these solutions get deployed on a global scale, how do we ensure that there's fair distribution and access to those resources, to those new innovations? And so these are some of the things that I think organizations are starting to think about, certainly part of the gaps that remain between where we are and where we need to be. When I talk to folks about climate risk and resiliency, I found many organizations to be kind of all over the board. I found some companies to be incredibly sophisticated and mature with specific tools and data sets and individual people managing these issues and embedded within the organization itself, while other firms were relying on yearly or perhaps once every 3 years consultants to come in and help them do this work for them. Either way, it is what it is, but there's clearly more need. There's a higher need to be able to begin embedding and standardizing how we account for the future and how we navigate this relatively complex path. When it comes to the physical risks that many organizations are managing, it continues to be water stress, it's heat waves, and it's wildfires. And today, many of the most material investments that you see organizations make are based on some of the nature-based solutions that are becoming more popular for adaptation measures. But the reality is that knowledge is relatively low when it comes to how to design and implement specific and measurable goals in this area of climate risk and resiliency. Whether you're a technology company or not, the idea of having the right data to be able to make the right decision at the right amount of time is increasingly relevant. And I think there's a real need for creating these open and trusted data ecosystems, regardless of your industry, to be able to make data sharing easier, and really leveraging the sophisticated differential privacy rules that are available to be able to empower people to make better decisions without or with consideration to their privacy needs as well. It's clear that we also need to bring different data sets together to really make informed decisions. So there's lots of open government data sets that exist in various pockets around the world. But when those data sets are brought together around product level details or organizational level details, then those decisions and those processes are only enriched and made more important. I also heard that there's a bunch of institutional challenges that Ben mentioned earlier, but when it comes to looking for and seeking partnership with the university system, some of the challenges that they have is a simple mismatch in timelines and definitions of success. It's the private sector's desire for short sprints and short-term projects versus, say, the academic calendar that many university systems follow. And so those things are certainly obstacles today, but certainly navigatable for the future. Also, the idea of being able to navigate these complex organizations on both sides, from private sector to the university, is intimidating, and it's often hard to understand. There's also capacity issues and different definitions of what partnerships actually mean that also have to be taken into consideration. All right, so as I looked across the various challenges that organizations are coping with, as I talked to some of the stakeholders within these organizations who are tackling these issues, there's several patterns emerged that I tried to package up as recommendations, working with Ben and the EarthLab team and others. And ultimately, I kind of built these 4 different collaboration pathways. And I just want to note that none of these concepts are necessarily novel or new. Sorry, my little video bar was flashing here. None of these are novel or new or are mutually exclusive. They simply represent short-term versus long-term, inexpensive versus potentially more expensive ways of thinking about collaboration between private sector and university. So the first idea, I've called the idea incubator. It really just builds on the role of the university as a convener, as a network, and the desire among private sector to often access this network and convening capability to work cooperatively across the industry and across institutional boundaries in order to collaborate on climate-related issues. This next idea around focused research is really about leveraging the resources and deep subject matter expertise within the university itself to work hand in hand with partners on specific and potentially proprietary problems and solutions. The third concept is that of a challenge grant. It can be called other things, but it's really an engagement model for providing the necessary resources in order to harness innovation within the university itself, as well as within the network that the university has the ability to influence, and ultimately shared with the public domain. And the last is really this concept of deep exploration, where organizations can work together over many years, perhaps, to create that kind of deep and long-lasting relationship with university partners that ultimately create new insights, potentially new IP, and results. So these are just a few of the ideas, and this is starting to bring me to the conclusion here. As I was reflecting kind of on this time we're in, it is clearly an unprecedented one. And for those of us working on climate-related issues, many of us are asking ourselves, how do we help our organizations contribute to a sustainable future, but also respond to the current events and other shocks in our system of today? Should we keep our heads down and just lean even harder into our work on climate and water stewardship and clean energy, or do we pause and do we take stock of our current cultural context and rethink, how results need to be achieved? At the end of the day, if our fellow citizens are being exploited and discriminated against, if global challenges like COVID-19 can so easily transcend national borders, and if society as a whole is only as safe as its most vulnerable members, then perhaps it doesn't matter what stage we make our next climate commitments. And the reality is, I think this is a critical time for the word and, literally and, as in, how do we collectively address this climate crisis and ensure that the solutions required improve livelihoods of all people on this planet? How do we improve the health of these critical ecosystems around the world and reduce global burden of human infectious disease? How do we transform our energy, our transportation, our buildings, our food systems, all within a decade, by the way, and address the structural racism that is shortening people of color's lives? These are obviously incredibly tough questions for any single organization to answer, which is why I get really excited about what the possibilities are of working together and the opportunities that we have to leverage the combined strengths of different organizations, different organizational capabilities to achieve a new level of impact and cultural consideration that simply can't be accomplished alone.